It was an ordinary September morning when Michael Thornton, a tourist from California, stepped into Cabin 12 at Pine Forest Campground in Oregon. As he moved some furniture around, the floorboards beneath him cracked. What seemed like a minor inconvenience soon turned into something far darker. His foot plunged into a hole, and as he scrambled to regain his balance, his phone's flashlight illuminated a horrifying sight: human bones and decayed clothing. Beneath the floor, hidden for a decade, lay a chilling secret. The cabin had been the setting for a family's tragic disappearance. Robert Harris, a 6-year-old programmer from Portland, had come here with his wife Emily, an elementary school teacher, and their 2 children, Sarah and Tommy. They had planned a quiet getaway, hoping to enjoy the beauty of the Oregon woods, fish at Crater Lake, and create lasting memories. But on the evening of their arrival, they were never seen again. Despite extensive search efforts over the following months, no trace of the Harris family was found. What happened to them? How did they vanish without a single clue? For 10 long years, their story remained a mystery. Then, Michael Thornton's discovery would finally begin to unravel the tragic truth. The Harris family's journey to Pine Forest Campground began, like so many others, a simple family getaway. It was meant to be a time of relaxation, a break from the busy grind of everyday life. Robert Harris, a 6-year-old software programmer from Portland, had planned every detail of the trip with precision. He had been working long hours at his tech job and had rarely spent time with his 2 young children, Sarah, aged 11, and Tommy, aged 8. His wife, Emily, an elementary school teacher, was equally looking forward to the trip, hoping to escape the stress of the school year and spend some quality time with her family. The family's departure from Portland on that summer morning seemed like any typical family outing. Their minivan, a blue Honda Odyssey, was packed with fishing gear, hiking equipment, and food for the week ahead. Emily, always organized, had packed books, board games for the children, and her beloved Canon camera, intending to capture memories of their time in the woods. The kids were eager, filled with excitement at the thought of fishing in nearby lakes and hiking through the towering pines. Sarah had dreams of spotting a deer, and Tommy was determined to catch his first fish. They made their way west along the Pacific coastline, stopping in Seaside, a small seaside town known for its charming atmosphere and fresh seafood. The family had lunch at a local restaurant, where Sarah and Tommy tucked into fish and chips, while Robert and Emily opted for crab cakes. The waitress, Jennifer Cole, would later recall how happy and relaxed the family seemed. It was clear they were ready for the adventure ahead. Over their meal, Robert asked the waitress for fishing recommendations. She pointed them to Crater Lake, a beautiful spot just a short drive from their cabin. With their spirits high, the family set off again, continuing on their journey to Pine Forest Campground, nestled in the serene, remote forests of Oregon. Upon arrival, they were greeted by the campground's administrator, Donald Kimball, who handed them the keys to cabin number 12. He gave them a brief rundown of the rules. No fires without special permission, trash must be disposed of properly, and quiet hours were to be observed after 10 p.m. He also warned them of the presence of black bears in the area, and advised them not to leave food outside. Despite these warnings, everything felt calm, almost idyllic. The air was fresh, the trees stood tall and proud around them, and the lake nearby shimmered in the afternoon sunday. The family quickly settled into their cabin. It was small but cozy, with 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, and a living room. The simple, functional furniture made it clear that this was not a luxury getaway, but rather a humble retreat from the hustle and bustle of city life. Robert unloaded the car while Emily and the children began exploring their temporary home. Tommy claimed the top bunk of the children's bunk bed with a grin, leading to a playful argument with Sarah, which their parents quickly resolved by suggesting they swap places each night. After some settling in, the family cooked dinner on the cabin's gas stove spaghetti with meat sauce, a dish the kids loved. They sat on the porch together, watching the sun dip behind the trees, planning out the next day's activities. That evening Robert, the avid fisherman, expressed his eagerness to go fishing early the next morning. Emily suggested taking a short walk around the woods first, allowing the children to get familiar with their surroundings. The family called Emily's parents, John and Mary Wilson, back in Portland. It was the last time anyone would hear from them. Emily spoke to her mother, telling her they had arrived safely, that the kids were delighted with the cabin, and that the weather was perfect for the activities they had planned. She promised to call in a couple of days with updates, but after that, silence. The next morning, the Harris family headed out for Crater Lake. Robert packed his fishing gear, while Emily brought a picnic basket, and Sarah and Tommy carried nets, excited to try their hands at fishing. The lake, located just a kilometer from the cabin, was a stunning spot, surrounded by tall pine trees and boasting clear, cold waters even during the warmer summer months. Fishing was a success. Robert caught several trout, and Tommy, much to his delight, caught his first perch. They had a family picnic by the lake, with Emily capturing the moment on her camera, the last photographs of them alive. Sarah was seen collecting stones, while Tommy proudly held up his catch. After lunch, the campground seemed quiet, the only other guests being an elderly couple, Frank and Dolores Miller, who stayed in a neighboring cabin. The Millers noticed the Harris children playing near their cabin in the afternoon, appearing carefree as they ran between the trees. By the evening, the Harris family was back at the cabin, preparing to cook dinner on the porch. Frank Miller, the neighbor, recalled hearing laughter and conversation coming from cabin number 12, a peaceful scene that seemed to paint the perfect picture of family life. Around 8 p.m., Robert was seen cleaning the fish he had caught, chatting briefly with Frank about the day's fishing. This would be the last confirmed sighting of the Harris family alive. The following day, the situation began to unravel. Donald Kimball, the campground manager, noticed that the Harris family's Honda Odyssey was still parked in the lot near cabin number 12. Given the quiet nature of the campground during the weekdays, it wasn't unusual for guests to disappear into the forest for hours at a time. But as evening fell and there was still no sign of the family, Kimball began to feel uneasy. The car was still parked in the same spot, the cabin eerily silent. He knocked on the door but received no answer. Thinking perhaps they were out enjoying the beautiful weather, he assumed they had gone on a long hike. By the next morning, Kimball returned to check on them. The car was still there, but the cabin was locked. The windows were closed, which struck him as odd, given the warm weather. He decided to use his master key to gain entry, but inside, the cabin appeared untouched. The beds were made, the dishes were washed, and personal belongings were neatly stored. Robert's fishing gear sat by the door, ready for their next outing. A map of the area lay on the kitchen table, with several hiking trails marked in red, highlighting the routes they planned to explore. But there were no signs of the family. Kimball contacted the Clatsop County Sheriff's Office, and soon the investigation began. Deputy Sheriff Bill Morrison arrived on the scene to inspect the cabin and the family's car. But there were no signs of struggle, no obvious evidence of foul play. The locked door, the absence of a fight, and the well-kept cabin all suggested that the family had left voluntarily, but where had they gone? And why had no one seen or heard from them since their last confirmed sighting? The investigation was underway, but the more they searched, the fewer answers they found. The search efforts continued in earnest, but there were no solid leads. Detective Sarah Clark from Portland joined the investigation, meticulously searching the cabin for clues. Meanwhile, search dogs scoured the woods and Crater Lake, with no results. There were no traces of the Harris family to be found, no clothing, no footprints, not even a hint as to where they might have gone. The eerie absence of any concrete evidence only deepened the mystery. As the search dragged on, the investigators were left with nothing but questions and a growing sense of confusion. What had happened to the Harris family? Where had they gone? The disappearance remained as inexplicable as it had been when it first occurred. The investigation continued, but it seemed as though the family had vanished into thin air. As each day passed without new clues, the tension surrounding the case grew, leaving investigators and the community alike in a state of uncomfortable uncertainty. The more the police and search teams delved into the forest, the more it became clear that the Harris family's fate was not going to be easily solved. It was a seemingly ordinary September morning when Michael Thornton, a civil engineer from California, stepped into Cabin 12 at Pine Forest Campground. He had rented the cabin for a weekend with friends, expecting a peaceful time away from the bustle of daily life. As he rearranged some furniture, his foot unexpectedly plunged through the floorboards, the old wood giving way beneath his weight. At first, Michael thought it was just a structural flaw, but as he steadied himself and shone his phone's flashlight into the hole, his stomach lurched. At the bottom of the hole, about 2 meters down, lay the horrifying discovery: human bones. As his flashlight illuminated the pit, the reality of what he was seeing hit him: decayed clothing and the skeletal remains of a family. The scene was more horrific than he could have imagined, but the worst was yet to come. The remains were those of 2 adults and 2 children, their identities still a mystery, but undoubtedly the victims of something terrible. Michael's shock turned to panic as he scrambled to get his friends, pulling them to the hole in the floor. One of them, David Chen, a doctor, immediately recognized the bodies as belonging to different ages, identifying them as a mother, father, and 2 children. Michael, now trembling, called emergency services. At first, the operator thought it might be a prank. The discovery of human remains beneath the floor of a cabin in a remote forest campground was so bizarre that it seemed almost impossible. But when Michael's voice turned serious and panicked, the dispatcher knew it was no joke. Within 20 minutes, police arrived, securing the area and cordoning off the site. As they carefully removed the remains, the investigation quickly turned into a complex and chilling puzzle. Forensic anthropologists confirmed the identities of the victims through dental records: Robert Harris, his wife Emily, and their children, Sarah and Tommy. The revelation sent shockwaves through the investigation team. The Harris family had been missing for 10 long years, and no one had suspected that they were buried under the very cabin that had been rented out to tourists over the years. The police quickly turned their attention to the cabin's owner at the time of the disappearance: Harold Milton, the campground's former manager. Harold had been a quiet, solitary figure known to most as a reliable but reclusive man. He had sold the campground to the county shortly after the family's disappearance, citing financial difficulties, but it was soon discovered that his actions before and after the Harris family's vanishing raised more questions than answers. For years, he had evaded suspicion, but as the investigation delved deeper, Milton's past came under scrutiny. Detective Sarah Clark, who had taken over the case after it went cold, reviewed Milton's background more closely. She uncovered a disturbing pattern of strange behavior. Milton had been the subject of complaints from female tourists at the campground. On several occasions, women had reported feeling uncomfortable around him, claiming he had followed them on hikes or made inappropriate remarks. Though these complaints had never been enough to charge him with anything, they painted a picture of a man who perhaps should have been watched more closely. When investigators pieced everything together, they began to connect the dots. Milton had been the last person to interact with the Harris family. He had been seen near their cabin before they disappeared, even speaking to Robert about the fishing conditions. His proximity to the family, combined with his strange behavior, made him an obvious person of interest. But there was more. The forensic evidence revealed that the family had not simply disappeared, they had been brutally murdered. Their remains showed signs of violent death. The skulls of the children bore the marks of blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with an axe. Robert had been tied up and forced to witness the brutal murders of his family before he too was killed. It was now clear. Milton had not only murdered the Harris family, he had gone to great lengths to hide his crime. He had buried their bodies under the floorboards of the cabin, covering them with lime to accelerate decomposition and preserve the bones. He had even taken care to repair the floor afterward, ensuring that no one would uncover the hidden grave for years. The investigation team now knew that the crime had been planned meticulously, not a spur-of-the-moment act, but a premeditated slaughter. Milton's role as the cabin manager allowed him the perfect cover for his grisly act. He had been able to access the cabin at any time under the pretense of maintenance or repairs, giving him the opportunity to carry out his crime without suspicion. For the next 10 years, he lived a quiet life, continuing to run the campground and even renting out the very cabin where the bodies lay, completely undisturbed. It was a chilling revelation. Milton had known what he had done, and yet he had lived among the very tourists who stayed in the cabin, a cruel reminder of the darkness buried beneath the floorboards. As detectives delved deeper into Milton's life, they uncovered even more horrifying details. In his personal diary, Milton had detailed his twisted obsession with the families who stayed at the campground. He had spent years fantasizing about luring a family to the cabin, eventually choosing the Harris family as his victims. His diary described how he had planned the killings, pretending to be a helpful forester and luring Robert to the cabin with the promise of a secret fishing spot. But once inside, Milton had trapped the family, locking the door behind them and attacking with an axe. The murders were cold, calculated, and carried out in the most horrific way possible. The truth about Harold Milton was both sickening and fascinating. The killer had been hiding in plain sight for years, operating under the radar, while his horrific crime remained a dark secret. It was only through the chance discovery of the bodies that the investigation gained momentum. The revelation that Milton had been living just miles from the site of his crimes, continuing his life as if nothing had happened, left everyone in shock. The moment of revelation came when Milton was arrested after the police linked him to the murders. As the investigation unfolded, Milton showed no remorse for his actions. When confronted with the evidence, the bloody axe, the diary entries, the photos of the family he had stalked, Milton finally confessed. He spoke of his twisted fantasies, of how the Harris family had been the perfect victims, and how he had meticulously planned their deaths. There was no sign of guilt, no tears, no regret. His chilling indifference to the suffering he had caused only added to the horror of his crimes. The arrest of Harold Milton was a moment of twisted justice, but it wasn't the end of the story. The case had left deep scars, not just on the surviving relatives of the Harris family, but on everyone who had learned of the horrors that had taken place beneath the floor of cabin number 12. Milton's trial, when it came, was a drawn-out affair. The prosecution presented the gruesome details of his crimes, while his defense team tried to have him declared insane. But the psychiatric evaluation showed that Milton was fully aware of his actions, and the jury found him guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to death. For those who had followed the case, the horror of what had happened lingered long after the trial. The family's tragic fate, the calculated cruelty of Milton's actions, and the eerie fact that he had been living so close to the scene of his crime made the case all the more chilling. It was a reminder that evil can hide in the most unsuspecting places, and sometimes the most horrific truths are the hardest to uncover. The story of the Harris family was not just about a crime. It was about the terrifying darkness that can lie just beneath the surface of everyday life. As the investigation into the disappearance of the Harris family deepened, all signs pointed toward Harold Milton, the former manager of Pine Forest Campground. For years he had remained a peripheral figure, a quiet and reclusive man with no apparent connection to the horror that had unfolded beneath his own cabin. But as the details of his life came to light, it became clear that Milton had been far more involved in the family's tragic fate than anyone had ever suspected. The more investigators dug into Milton's past, the more disturbing his actions appeared. He had always been a solitary figure, a man who preferred to keep to himself, with few close relationships. Those who had crossed paths with him described him as distant and somewhat odd. He had worked at the campground for years, overseeing the cabins and dealing with guests, yet he never seemed particularly warm or friendly. Over time, his behavior began to raise some concerns among the staff and visitors. Complaints from female tourists, though never serious enough to warrant formal charges, painted a picture of a man who was uncomfortable to be around. Some women had claimed he had followed them on walks, while others spoke of his strange comments. But these were isolated incidents, and no one thought to investigate further, brushing it off as awkwardness or eccentricity. As it turned out, these subtle red flags were just the beginning of a much darker truth. Milton's odd behavior was not just harmless eccentricity. It was the surface of a deeply disturbed mind. His fixation on the families who visited the campground, particularly those with young children, became clearer as the investigation progressed. For years he had been keeping a personal diary, documenting his thoughts and actions. It was in this journal that the true extent of his twisted obsession came to light. Milton had meticulously planned the murder of the Harris family, his diary revealing that he had carefully chosen them as his victims from the moment they arrived at the campground. Milton's dark fantasy had been building for months. He had watched the family closely, noting their habits, their routines, and the moments they spent together. To him, they were the perfect family, a family he could control, a family he could trap. The night before the murders, he had made preparations. He knew exactly how he would lure Robert Harris into the cabin under the pretense of showing him a secret fishing spot. Milton had been a forester for years, so he was familiar with the land and had the perfect excuse. When Robert agreed to follow him, Milton led him back to the cabin, where he immediately attacked him with an axe. But Milton didn't stop there. His crime was calculated and cold-blooded. Once Robert was incapacitated, he bound him to a chair, forcing him to watch as his wife and children were murdered. Emily, in a desperate attempt to protect her children, was violated before Milton took their lives as well. The brutality of his actions sent chills through those who uncovered the details. His lack of remorse was equally horrifying. As detectives pieced together the events, it became clear that Milton had no guilt for what he had done. He was fully aware of his actions, and the journal entries described the thrill he had felt while planning and carrying out the murders. Milton's arrest was a moment of unsettling calm. He was found in his home, packing up his belongings as though he were preparing to leave, his life seemingly unaffected by the horror he had unleashed. He did not resist arrest. In fact, he showed little emotion when confronted with the evidence. When detectives presented him with photographs, bloody clothing, and his own diary, Milton simply shrugged, offering no explanation or regret. It was as though he viewed his crime as just another part of his life, a life he had carefully constructed to fulfill his darkest desires. As Milton was led away in handcuffs, the investigation turned to his trial. The details of his crimes were laid bare before the court, and the horror of his actions was made public for the first time. The prosecution painted a chilling picture of a man who had methodically planned and executed the murder of an innocent family. His motive, it seemed, was simply his obsession with control, with power, and with fulfilling the twisted fantasies he had nurtured for so long. Throughout the trial, Milton remained impassive, offering no words of remorse, no sign of guilt. His cold indifference to the suffering he had caused only intensified the horror of his crime. The trial was a painful experience for the surviving relatives of the Harris family. Emily's parents, John and Mary Wilson, traveled to the courtroom to witness the man responsible for their daughter's death face justice. It was a difficult decision for them, a final step in their long journey of grief and loss. They had held on to the hope that somehow the family might still be alive, that maybe, just maybe, they had left the area and were hiding somewhere. But with each piece of evidence that came to light, it became clear that their worst fears had been realized. For the Wilsons, attending the trial was a way to confront the man who had destroyed their family. They were determined to see him held accountable for what he had done, to make sure he faced the full consequences of his actions. It was also a chance for them to finally mourn, to grieve for the daughter and grandchildren they had lost, and to begin the slow process of healing. Emily's parents were not alone in their pain. Many who had followed the case over the years, both in the local community and beyond, felt a deep sense of sadness and anger. The idea that such a horrific crime had taken place in their midst, in a place so seemingly peaceful, had shaken them to their core. As the trial proceeded, the details of Milton's life became even more unsettling. He had been living in the very community where his crimes had occurred. Continuing his work as a forester, he had even been seen in the area after the murders, walking around as if nothing had happened. For those who had known him, it was as though he had slipped away from the reality of his crimes, hiding in plain sight for years. His complete lack of remorse or emotion was deeply unsettling. The final verdict came down swiftly. Milton was found guilty on all counts. The jury had no doubt as to his guilt. There was no question that he had carefully planned and executed the murders of the Harris family. The defense had tried to argue that Milton was insane, but the psychiatric evaluations showed that he was fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to death. The courtroom was silent as the judge read out the verdict. The Harris family's relatives, though still grieving, felt a small measure of justice had been served. But the impact of Milton's crimes was far from over. The memories of the Harris family and the horror of what had happened in that cabin would haunt those who had followed the case for years to come. As the years passed, the memory of the crimes faded from the headlines, but for those who had been affected, it remained an open wound, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk beneath the surface of even the most ordinary places. As for the Pine Forest Campground, it was never quite the same. Cabin number 12 was eventually demolished, and in its place, a small memorial garden was created to honor the Harris family. 4 trees were planted, one for each member of the family, with a plaque bearing their names. Visitors to the campground sometimes left flowers or notes, remembering the family they had never met, but whose story had touched them deeply. The trial had brought some measure of closure, but it had also opened old wounds. The Harris family would never be forgotten, and neither would the man who had taken their lives in such a brutal and calculated manner. The case of Harold Milton would remain a dark chapter in the history of Pine Forest Campground, a chilling reminder of the evil that can lie hidden beneath the surface, even in the most peaceful of settings. The horror of the Harris family's tragic end will never be forgotten. After years of uncertainty, the discovery of their remains brought a long-awaited, albeit chilling, sense of closure. The community, once shaken by the disappearance of 4 innocent lives, could finally begin to heal. In memory of Robert, Emily, Sarah, and Tommy, a small memorial was created at Pine Forest Campground. The notorious Cabin 12, where their lives were so brutally ended, was demolished, and in its place 4 trees were planted, one for each member of the family. A plaque now stands in their honor, a quiet reminder of the lives lost too soon. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small tokens of remembrance as they walk past, unaware of the dark history that haunts the spot. But even with the arrest and sentencing of Harold Milton, the impact of the case continued to ripple through the community and beyond. Investigators, reporters, and even those who had only heard the story were left haunted by the chilling nature of the crime. For the Wilson family, the parents of Emily, the pain never fully subsided. While justice had been served in the form of Milton's trial and conviction, no amount of punishment could bring back what they had lost. As the case closed, many questions remained. Was there something more sinister lurking in Milton's past, something that could have been prevented? The haunting image of a man living among the community, with a dark secret hidden in plain sight, left many wondering how often evil is allowed to fester unnoticed. If you found this story intriguing, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true crime cases, unsolved mysteries, and gripping investigations. Hit the bell icon to stay updated on our latest content. Stay with us as we continue to uncover the chilling truths that hide in the shadows